fine. So we are now recording. And I'll start by acknowledging the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which CSU's campuses are located, and pay respect to their elders, both past and present. So it's helpful for us to keep a record of who's attending. So if people want to say a quick hello in the chat, tell us who you are and where you're from, that would be great. It's a normal format for research seminars today. So David will be presenting for about 25 minutes, half an hour, something like that. Do we think, David? So there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. And you can type questions as you go into the chat. I think David's going to present first, and then I'll collate those questions and David can address them afterwards. So today's seminar is titled Emotion in Digital Culture, the Transformed Public, Private, Personal Interplay of Affect in Socially Mediated and Curated Contemporary Life. And our presenter is Professor David Marshall, and we're delighted that David's presenting today. This is his first seminar in the school since he joined us in April of this year. David's published a great many articles and book chapters, as well as 11 books. And his research investigates our political, economic, cultural, and celebrity public personality systems and their transformations in and through digital culture. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David, and I'm going to try and pin David now. So can everyone see David's video sort of full screen? If not, I know he's going to use some interesting presentation techniques. So use the view button at the top right and speaker if David's not full screen. So I'll pass over to David now.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks for this opportunity to present my research. I hope the image looks okay. I hope it's full screen is probably the best way to go. I'm not separating screens, so it's me with my presentation itself. And as you can see from the title, my talk today is on emotion in digital culture. The subtitle identifies the mélange of public, private, and personal levels that inhabit all of our uses of online culture and forms of social media that are privileged. To begin, it is important and significant to be aware of the very complexity of emotion. I've listed a series of categories of emotion, but there are many others listed in the text part here, beyond anger, sadness, happiness, fear, surprise, anxiousness, along with an array of mixed subcategories that move across the different interplay of emotion. As we express ourselves in digital culture, yes, there is information, but embedded in this modeling of information is a curating of sentiment, essentially guiding our intentionality. In digital culture, we need this conceptual reinvestigation of how humans reposition emotion in the context of text, image, and recursive connection to others. Our emotional curating also does something more, a duality of thinking for this research of the profound connection to media platforms and what I call the conversion of our curation of sentiment into its commercial, social, economic formations and related cultural paths and ends online. So now let's move into understanding the conceptual pathways for understanding digital emotion. Grouping much of the precursory analysis that has informed communication and media in particular, and definitively informs this transformative restructuring of emotion by a technology of online culture, is the integration of the term affect. Emotion itself has been explored in a variety of ways. Before affect as a theory, more or less in the last 50 years or so, and application moved to center stage. The etymology of emotion, its clear relationship to the idea of movement and motion, is something that has been explored in philosophy, from Plato and Aristotle to St. Augustine. Spinoza in the 17th century specifically used the term affectus to capture the way in which emotion moves between sense and meaning. This way of thinking informs what has been explored in recent research as gestural communication. In addition, it has also led to researchers such as Tony Sampson, didn't put his name down there, wrote about using the idea of emotional contagion to understand the actual migration of affective connections across populations and collectives. Gilles Deleuze, in particular, led to affect moving through cultural studies, cultural theory, and its thinking of affect and its relation to societies of control is the way that Deleuze described it. My own research intersects with this, specifically with the term that I've used, for quite a long time about affective power, and looking at public personality systems as whether they're political or whether they're cultural, are forms of our connection to something that may or may not be that significant, but we feel the sense of its emotional significance to our cultures. Others developed how affect led to a cultural economy, and a particular scholar connected to that was Lawrence Grossberg, writing in about the 1990s. But probably most significantly for our understanding in a qualitative research sense, affect is a neurotransmitter that may or may not be totally attributed to meaning and understanding. Okay, so that's that difference between the actual grounding of something that we often think of as emotion that's fully identifiable to something that's affect, which is a sense or feeling, which I'm feeling right now. I'm an incredible nervousness. No, I'm kidding. I hope I'm kidding at least. This was Brian Masumi's quite remarkable work in this area. Just as a little aside, and it definitely doesn't relate to this at all when I was doing my work as a PhD student, Brian Masumi was one of my co-supervisors of my PhD at McGill University, but doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you even know who Brian Masumi is, but he's an interesting sort of person. Affect is central to Masumi's work, and how capitalism, and for us in this project, what I call the intercommunication industries of online culture, have circulated the feeling of connection of affect. Masumi uses the contagious connection of starlings. Now I'm going to, as a way to understand this, now I'm going to click on something that will eliminate me, but produce an image of starlings, and I might do it more than once. But let's take a look at these sorts of things as I describe it. So he more or less described, I'm not going to use, I wish I had a Giphy that would work on this one to show the movement of these birds around all the time as they express their movement, their affective connection to others, and their movement through space. And they do it within, tenths of seconds in response to other starlings that are around them. It's something that we don't fully understand in the human condition, but we are constantly doing that. And that's why even that term that I used before, that gestural communication, I know I'm gesturing here and probably driving you crazy with the movement of my hands, but nonetheless, these are forms that are playing with our dimensions of how we present affect, how we raise an eye, how we move things in a particular way is actually not that. Actually, you can't see me. I just realized I eliminated me there, didn't I? These are the advantages of images, but I want you to think about those sorts of things just a little bit. There's another starling group there, thousands of birds that are working together. It's not identical to what goes on in digital culture, but there are aspects of it that are as much individualized, but affectively connecting us in particular ways. And it was interesting even today in going to the foundation moment to realize that there is this odd connection as we had Zoom connections to other other campuses, and as our VC spoke, that were really interesting, plus people at individual places also somehow affectively connected, but not fully understanding the emotional, I don't know, intersection of everything that's going on. So reaction is fast in the thousands of starlings as they move massively forward collectively. Masumi tries to get us thinking of how we can shift the correlation of our affective linkage by capitalism in digital culture to something different and more qualitatively connecting us. So he's concerned about how a kind of commercial culture has produced a relationship to what we think is important that's very powerful, but he is thinking that, well, this could shift a little bit. But in any case, it is a patterning of a collective action that's kind of like starlings, and that's what he talks about. I want to add that this research on affect has informed the transformation of politics, and one of the scholars, Protavi's work, here at least can inform the way that our political systems of representation are in a state of precarity in contemporary culture. And something that I've used in my writing is a differentiation between what we've had politically as representational culture to something that is now a presentational culture, that all of us are in a position of presenting at the same time as we are being represented. Something has changed in our relations and our structures that it's difficult to determine fully what's happening with it, but it is changing our politics as much as our everyday lives. And finally, in this grouping of emotion through affect theory is the equally comprehensive work of Darren Ellis and Ian Tucker, who wrote about digital emotion. So I trying to mention these people that are attached to it, that have informed how I've gone forward with my research as well. Now, the second conceptual pathway to digital emotion is to integrate at some level the scientific, and that is our next direction. So our second conceptual pathway then is affect science. There are literally thousands, and I'm not kidding, who have written in this area with different forms of, Wasim probably knows this better than anyone else in the room. Thousands who've written in this area with different forms of nominated research areas. One of them, Rosalind Picard, an MIT scholar for the last 30 years, developed something that she called, and it moved massively through our culture, affective computing, and was instrumental in advancing the movement from the human neural to the digital. Haptic technologies, things that people have had in a sense, connection to gaming, computing, as much as defense strategies in many military cultures, has moved its way through our lives as well, that we feel sometimes the little vibration. If anyone's played video games or computer games, you know what I'm talking about with this. Collectively, cognitive scientists such as Goldenberg and Gross have pulled work in the related area of how emotion moves through cultures via social media, images, and gestures. So there's a massive amount of research that needs to be understood from this idea of converting affect into a computing transformation and reading of us. And David Sumter, an expert in human-computer interactions from a mathematical perspective, is very useful for understanding the conversion of emotion in what the industry would call artificial intelligence. The algorithmic conversion of online choice expression, Sumter explains as PCA, principal component analysis, as an industrial reading. And this is something that is done consistently online by all the different industries that are producing for us, producing our platforms, producing our websites, and highlights this PCA, highlights on how to group significant sentimental connection through social media sharing of informations and its affective connections. Go on to the next thing here. As you can see, this work on emotion and digital culture is filled with work across disciplines, from the humanities and the social sciences to neurology, computer science, and mathematics. What is generated is AI, artificial intelligence, but also connected to something that has about a 30-year tradition called emotional intelligence, a psychological exploration by Goleman, who was originally a New York Times psychologist, but developed something that actually became something massive about 20 to 30 years ago, called emotional intelligence. But others, including Savule and Barrett, Barrett originally from, I think, Northeastern University, and Savule from one of the Massachusetts universities too, have looked at how we as humans read affect and put it into our lives and future applications in life. To get into this space, I wanted to talk through our human curation and guidance of ourselves emotionally in digital culture. So we might have this idea that, it's emotion, we don't really plan it, we don't really do it, but there is tons of another layer of communicative or information structures that changes the way in which humans interrelate. And this is what we're experiencing and transforming, in a sense, our cultures. How we, in effect, are reconstructing our human everyday lives with layers and pathways in emotional intelligence, reconfigured with our transformation of collective and individual identity, both collective and individual identity online. I call this, and I've said it a couple of times before, curation. Now, curation. Curation is how we collectively, individually, and strategically and fictionally form, manage, and guide our online emotional persona. Chenny Leopold uses the Deleuzian term of dividual, and I'm really drawn to that idea, not individual, but dividual. Tero Karppi, another interesting writer about these things, separates our activities from the online industry with the term engagement, employed by Facebook and Meta, call them the same thing, to map their relative connection and potential disconnection from subscribers, friends, and followers. So it's almost as if the social media platforms are constantly interested in how much we engage, and they begin to worry about our level of engagement. And the whole program of what they're trying to do is to keep our engagement, keep putting techniques of emotional connection constantly into what we do. Dividual and dividuated helps define the duality of persona. We guide ourselves in an affective, digitally conveyed expressions, of what we think. And in a way, we even integrate the way we are read by others collectively, and what I've called earlier, the intercommunication industry of our digitally reconfigured lives and culture. So, in this complicated duality of personality and its affect to emotional attribution formation, the industry, again, collectively, I call it the intercommunication industry. I think I've used it several times now, you'll never forget it now, for its interpersonal plus highly mediated structure of online communication, organized by industries driven by algorithmic reading of collectives and individuals. Where curation is us, correlation is the industry that shapes platforms. What was once called GAFAM, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, but with Meta, it can now be called Gamma. All right, that's me making it up. I'm not sure if it's out in the system that way. Or possibly Gamut, if we include TikTok and WeChat, who are also major players. The algorithmic work of social media platforms and online structures is the production of a correlation of affective behavior to some sort of commercial value, as well as some sort of collective configuration of identity. That notion of that Carpe brought up of engagement that social media platforms are involved with, of identity in industrial relational affective influence. Those who imagine themselves as influencers structure themselves to match the directions of principal component analyses generated by the industrial reformation of affective meaning and connection and value. An expanding formation of AI, artificial intelligence, is developed by Richard Young, called artificial emotional intelligence, which identifies how the industry has connected and collaborated with affective science and affective computing in its development of aspects of smart, often misused, expressive affective machines. But artificial emotional intelligence, in its attempt to capture our present and future, is far from complete. I would say Richard Young's work is actually not that great. I shouldn't say that in case this goes out on YouTube and comes back at me in some other way, Simon. But it's an okay reading of it, but it's just not that well done. We are all curating our affective digital selves, and industry is correlating it to provide associative connections. But there are some interesting patterns that have emerged that try to gesture what we are saying, but more importantly in this study, what we are feeling. And these can be grouped in what I call emblematic structures. And this is also drawn, and you'll notice in a second, from linguistic sort of analyses. Emblematic analysis and its association with digital culture has been a major and expanding area of analysis in linguistics. Two key investigators are Michelle Zapapigna in her book Searchable Talk and Other Articles. She's actually from Sydney. And Gretchen McCulloch in a book that she's written, but lots of articles and website stuff called Because Internet. The formation of emblems is a way to characterize our structures of affective connection on social media. In some ways, it's like heraldry. In some ways, it's almost the way in which images were used by knights 500 or 600 years ago, or patterns of how we connected in terms of maybe sports teams in the current moment. But what happens in online culture is the using of these formation of emblems is a way to characterize our structures of affective connection in social media. Using emoji. Some people say it's in decline. I think it's being normalized in some way. It's just something that you use almost in a regular way, not that it's exciting. Hashtags, and you can see over in my images part over here, some of these things that are there. Memes and forms of facial recognition expression, depending on which platform you use, they become a little bit more obsessively related to how you improve how you look. In fact, maybe I've changed the actual look of my screen to produce a little bit different look to who I am. But generally, what's being monitored is that fourth image there of what we indicate by anger, sadness, happiness, and these become other forms of information. And all of these are affective connectors that are a form of curation to build collectives, and they're forms of an industry building further principal component analyses to connect to us. The digital emotional persona is at least reconfigured in our efforts to produce what I call one-step removal from our forms of emotional expression. So it becomes, as we use these techniques, emblematic structures, part thought, part text, part image, but not completely part self. These are not who we are. They are versions of ourselves, the same way we do all sorts of other things that we are kind of using in a technique of distance as much as presence of the emotional. All right. Now, I'll go to the conclusion. As you can imagine, in this area of research, with its fascinating intersection with other disciplines of science and culture, this project has many possible manifestations. What I've outlined in my presentation today is a dual negotiation of what constitutes emotion and identity in digital culture, an industry that works to map our behavior, predispositions, and connects to producing collectives that have commercial value through a kind of programmatic advertising. And billions of people producing collective connection in a manner of speed and curation that affectively resembles the world of starlings and their negotiation of collective flight. So thank you for being here today, and I'm open to discussions and questions. This is just a quick sort of thing of what I've published so far connected to this. I have a book that's supposed to be coming out in the next year or so, but these are just kind of just a list of sort of different articles that are attached to it. And that, my friends, is the end.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, David. That's fascinating. Now, there haven't been any questions in the chat. Louise expressed her envy of you working with Brian Masumi, but I assume that means everyone's been saving them up to ask in person at the end. So I'll open it up now if anyone has any questions.
Okay, it was overwhelming, I see.
David, I'm always good for a question.
Okay.
Of course, my ears are pricking up all over the place because I've spent lots of time looking into these things to do with how things emerge. So I spent a lot of time looking at John Protevi and Deleuze and Masumi, and my engagement was about embodied knowledge, like how do we make choices about what we're going to do next, what's available to us. And I got really excited about Jane Bennett and Vibrant Matter. And I also really love Sarah Ahmed's writing, but I'm prompted to say something because I'm curious to hear. I'm sure some of this you're familiar with some of the literature in the creative arts in the world of. Well, I don't want to put you on the spot. What am I trying to say? I'm aware of a related conversation in the work of artists like David Rokeby. Early interactive artists who are all about that kind of triggering and the emotional dimension of technology, I guess. So I guess maybe that's where my question is, around that emotional dimension of technology, which I think is, that's a thread I'm picking up clearly from what you're talking about. So more a reflection than anything, but to say I'm listening in with great interest, and thank you.
Okay. It's good to go into those details, because one of the things that occurs with anybody who is entering in this space, and actually Wasim and I have talked a little bit about this, is there are all sorts of permutations of where it could go further. So if you're looking at something like the creative industries and its transformation of something that's why I use that term principal component analysis, it never fits into it. The creative, the emotional is never completely put into the algorithmic. And that's the kind of point that I would like to make, is that no matter what we're doing, these are, and I'm not saying they're all negative, they are transitions of what we imagine as a form of information or communication. And they're not always there. So my reaction of just going like this, like that, back like that, that is an emotional moment, but you don't know fully whether I've made it up, my persona, my fictive self has made it up, or whether it's in fact how I'm feeling at that moment. And that's the advantage of understanding that technology itself, as much as it neutralizes the idea of what we're doing, doesn't neutralize us any more than starlings. I don't know if that helps people, but it shows the complexity of what we're dealing with.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, we're just trying to sort of find these points of connection, aren't we, in these early dialogues across the school, across the faculty.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I noticed you with your hand up, and I'm intrigued because I know that I was thinking all the way through this that there's obviously a lot of correlation with your work. So it's great to hear that you've been discussing already. So over to you, Wasim.
Thanks very much, David. I mean, for a very thought-provoking presentation. So I think I'm just trying to understand, for example, like, do you foresee in your research when you take this work forward, do you plan to differentiate between under the affect between the feeling and the emotion, or you don't plan to, or you don't foresee making that distinction, and then because obviously that distinction is not always clear in psychology. So this is one thing, that because as you mentioned in the beginning, that affect actually moves us, right? That movement. So I'm trying to understand, for example, this is one, that whether you do intend to make these distinctions, if you take this work forward, in order to help us understand that actually how our patterns of thinking actually change as well as we continue to engage more and more with technology, right? Because it is not simply that our emotions, spontaneous emotions, the way we act change, but actually our patterns of thinking change, because of technology. So this is one thing that I would like to, have your say on that. And the second thing is, holistically speaking, how do you foresee taking this work forward, right? This line of research that you are, so that's why I will be very keen to, have your opinion on that. Thank you.
Yeah, first point, yes, exactly. Exactly what you're referring to. There's something related to the relationship of technology changing human culture. And we feel that regularly, and generationally, we feel those sorts of differences between how one generation is picking it up and says, oh, I don't remember a pre-online life. I don't remember social media before I was born. It was always there. There wasn't a sort of structure of those things. And these are interesting dimensions that relate to the past, and relate to the past notion of how emotion has moved, but it's not identical. So one of the things that's really interesting to me is probably meme culture and its total difference from how probably comedy was organized for the last century. And it's not that we can completely work out, did the technology change it? Are we, the term I often use is mediatized, that we're levels and layers of reorganization. It's not quite simulation, but it's a reorganization of the self. And that's why I use that notion of dividual, that we are divided. And that's why I use the notion of dual persona a great deal as well, that there is an industry notion of who we are, and then there's a self version of who we are, and neither of them are actually who we are because we are negotiating those relationships all the time. And it's hard for people to get a full handle on that it's not just technology, it's our negotiation of the technology as well. One of the other insights I think is really important, and it comes from a kind of cultural studies tradition, is to be always aware that what we think of as a technology and its smoothness of producing a new outcome has almost never happened with humans. And it's important to understand that, yeah, it's there. Hamid, you would remember that I made that slight critique of surveys in about teaching and how students are surveyed. It changes, and we negotiate however we correspond and relate. If a survey is in a certain way, it produces a different relationship than something else. It doesn't mean that it's accurately identifying the students themselves, but it has technologically been part of the organization of what university constitutes. So these are things that are very difficult for people who are mathematically inclined to understand, that there's a lot going on. And I think you've identified it too, Wasim, the psychological. I've identified the cultural, I suppose, within that sort of dimension. But technically, if you're talking about where my research is going, I want to talk to the industry massively and say, you know, in an open sort of way, I want to know what they think they are doing. They resist it entirely. I've asked many, many times, but the best strategy for me is actually to go to one of their conferences and not deal with them in any other way, but in, you know, a quiet sort of way, not quiet, but open sort of way that it's not fully defined. And that is difficult. I've set up collaborative projects with people overseas to sort of get into that space, but it's super difficult to move into the platform world, I suppose, the online world and what they think is being achieved by this emotional connection. Nonetheless, it's massively connected to advertising. Okay. I probably said too much there.
Okay, so there's a few hands raised. I think I've got them in the right order. So we'll come to Kay next and then Jared and Michelle. So Kay, over to you for your question.
Thank you. That was really interesting and I really appreciated, although some of it I think went over my head. And so that sort of reflects my question a little bit, because I'm really interested in digital citizenship. I hate that term, but the concept of how we teach our students to be aware of these connections and these influences that interacting in social media and interacting online is having. And also I hope, and I don't know, but I hope we try to teach students, school students, I'm talking about not our uni students, school students, how they do need to dividuate themselves, and how they do need to be aware of the fact that they probably are doing that subconsciously in some ways, but also that they need to be strategic and aware of it, because if they allow themselves to be truly who they are online, that could have potential issues, lead to potential issues in like the immediate and also in the future. So your research is at a really high level, and I would like to know how we can, or whether we can, or whether we should be able to break this down to a level, because I think teachers struggle with this as well, school teachers, and I think they struggle with understanding the concepts, as I do in some respects, at that really high level. But how do we start to break this down? Because I think it's really important that even from the youngest age, students have the opportunity to be aware of the fact that they are being influenced and their emotions are being captured, that how they present, all of those things are a part of their life going forward and their formation.
Yeah, and I think the big thing with that is to realize the human condition is a curation.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. So every element curates us slightly differently. And the more sophisticated, in a sense, digital emotional intelligence, whatever term we want to use, is incredibly important for youth. That they have to understand that there are transformations which are not the same as, you know, having a fun time out in the playground at the school, which I regularly hear on Piper Street where I am. But it's not the same as what will occur in an online environment. And almost all kids go through some moment where they realize that they are misread. And the key thing with those sorts of things is to always position it as a version of the self, which is really tough. And that's why the divided quality of dividual is really, really important. The idea of is that we're all singular, but we're not. When I walk, what I always do in my explanations in my world of communication over time is to say and try to explain this notion of persona and digital persona. It's totally different when I walk into a shop and I order bread. And the relationship that I have is totally different than what's happening right now. right?
Yeah.
And that difference is something that you have to explain to kids all the time. Every movement produces a slight different version of yourself. You think you're the same, but the person viewing you actually transforms yourself. And that's why I know it's difficult, but I think using the starlings would be incredible with children to work out that we're always related to what's around us. If it's a technological relationship, that changes it even in a different way. If it's a personal, interpersonal relationship, it changes it again. If it's a work relationship and it's collegial, it changes it again. And that's the sort of thing that I think is there. And probably, and I guess this is something that just doesn't happen in schools, we don't get into that social psychological space. And we don't get into its connection literally to 5 disciplines: linguistics, neuroscience, philosophy, all those things. And that, I hope it's part of what I can try to achieve with this.
Yeah, so maybe I'm hoping that you would be open to maybe having a discussion with us and the TL team about how we can build some of this into our digital citizenship subject, and because I don't think teachers really are necessarily as aware of it either.
Yeah, I would totally be open to that.
That would be great. Thank you.
My desire and my realization in terms of researching this is it has to be collaborative. The complexity, Wasim, you would know this too. The complexity is so large that even as you move into certain space, you do feel, oh, wait a minute, I missed this, this, and this. I'm comfortable with that. I think that's part of being an academic, but also a little anxious sometimes that I don't fully understand an aspect that some other area of academia or teaching would understand and be able to use really, really well. I'm happy to be involved in that.
Thank you.
Jared, your question.
Thanks for the fantastic presentation. Now I'm coming into this as an historian, so 90% of what you said probably went flying straight over my head. So please, I apologize if you've already answered kind of what I'm saying. And I think you kind of have in response to some of the other questions, but I guess my default position as a historian with anything almost is to kind of reflexively be skeptical of anyone saying, this is new. So I guess my question is, haven't we always curated our emotions in response to our social and cultural milieu? It's just that we're now curating our emotions in an online milieu where pre-internet we did it in response to face-to-face, a face-to-face sort of milieu, although through letters and all sorts of things as well, which was not face-to-face. And I was intrigued to see that even you said, I think towards the end of your presentation, that some of our online curation that's happening at the moment, I can't remember if it was in relation to memes or something like that, but it was very similar to medieval heraldry, which then it was like, yeah, well, that's what I mean. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And a lot of what you were saying sort of did remind me of what art historian Stephen Greenblatt talks about when he wrote that book ages ago, when he looked at Renaissance noblemen and their self-fashioning and how they have to go about self-fashioning all the time. There's
a really interesting scholar from the University of Siena, and his name is he goes by Gianni, which becomes Johnny in English, I think. Giovanni is his real name, Guastella. And he wrote a book about a kind of developed this idea of the word of mouth culture, medieval, ancient sort of relationships, and how it kind of, interestingly, was one of the reasons why terrible things happened in the Roman Empire, because it moved in a rumor sort of structural way. what I gained from reading his stuff, and I have to admit that I'm also doing a cultural history of fame 6-volume thing that parallels the cultural history of emotion. I'm the series editor of that. So I'm quite aware of cultural history sort of issues. But what's interesting about it is I think, and I've written a little bit about this too, that we are in a new word of mouth culture that happens to be online. It's getting converted into these emblematic structures, could be heraldry sort of structures, but there's something about it that has produced a new kind of instability, which is really similar to 2000 years ago, incredibly similar. And that's what I would say is there are aspects of it that are, yes, all pattern of how humans have related to humans for thousands of years. But there are patterns that break down. And you can't guarantee that what is privileged and not privileged is identical to what it was 200 years ago. But it probably is connected. So even as we create new elements of it, we're still humans and we still play in that space of a communicative relationship that I think is really important. And I would say, yes, I'd expect a good referee's report, what you're doing, Jared, and taking it apart that way, and I would rewrite it appropriately. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great response. Thanks.
Very interesting. Michelle.
Thank you. I had to run away to get my webcam, so I hope that I didn't miss the gist, David. But I'm really interested in the notion of affect theory and sound. And so affect theory and sound and placemaking. And maybe you and I could have a corridor chat about that one day. But as you were going on with your talking, I was thinking around, so you're talking about identity, but I think you've dropped to the I there. I think I was out while you were talking about that. Emotional connection, right, and identity in that digital online space, and just wondering whether that kind of thinking I can apply to some of the thinking that I'm doing around how we make meaning or make sense of place through sound, and what's a effect that sounds might have on us, and give us that kind of emotional connection to place. So there's a whole lot of words just spewed at you, but maybe we could have a bigger chat about that one day. But I think what I was thinking is, what you're thinking around in the digital space around connection and stuff. Perhaps I'm interested in the local space, right? So how we connect locally.
Yeah, and you're talking about something that I probably didn't get into as much because I moved into the visualization of how these markers of meaning, so I'm doing memes and facial recognition, but it's all there. To give you just a quick example, I'm in Bathurst and I'm amazed at how early and how different the birds are every morning at about 5:25. And they speak to me, but they also produce a pattern of relation that is not connected necessarily to them, but is connected to how I'm thinking. And that happens with any kind of sound and place, no matter where we are. And it could be as simple as how we're comfortable in some spaces with other sounds being there and not comfortable in other ones. Some people have the capacity to privilege individual sounds. Some people are drawn in spatial things to ambient sounds being overwhelming to them. They hear a soundtrack music and they literally cannot hear other people. I'm probably closer to that. I listen to the music before I listen to the person, sadly. Does anyone want to play some music? Let's do that as a change up. But the key thing with that aspect of sound is, yes, it is absolutely quite similarly constituting what I've been talking about in terms of the technological dimensions of online culture. It is different, and I think it's wise to think of what Jared has talked about too. The historical dimensions of sound are complex, but they're always kind of there on one level or another. Mediatization of the sound is definitely a change, and it's done in all sorts of ways, not just as vocoders. We've transformed actually how people sing, but it's transforming all sorts of other dimensions too. It's an area of investigation, and Michelle, just by bringing that up, I realize that, again, another dimension. The thing about this is it requires massive research collaboration to fully pull it together.
I think that sounds can be signifiers as well. So you're talking about memes and stuff as signifiers, and I think that there's sounds can be signifiers, and that's been written about, right? In terms of and sounds and soundscape as a signifier. If we think about soundscape and landscape in a similar kind of a way, but that's my interest in affect theory and emotion and a connection to place.
Thanks for that. Where are we now?
We got 7 minutes. I noticed Wasim has his hand up.
Sorry, asking another question. So David, because earlier you mentioned that in having different personas, in the digital environment, I wonder, because digital environment, because of its obviously inherent technological characteristics, because the magnitude and speed of information, they are unprecedented in the digital environment. So in the previous cultures, we didn't have both of these elements at the same level. And I think they are creating unprecedented and conflicting demands on people, which actually create some sort of a discord, if you may like, or conflicting expectations and our capacities to respond to these expectations. And I think case comment, I think a lot of our kids actually are torn because of these conflicts in those expectations, right? Because they're different cultures, but our human capacities inherently are not actually designed, in my view at least, to respond to them in a same way, right? It's not a 24/7. We can't operate 24/7, and we can't respond to 2,000 tweets. So so I don't know what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's not the same thought, but one of the things I brought up, it's an area that I've built over the last probably about 10 years, I guess. I think there's been a shift, and this is a challenge to Jared's sort of idea. I think there's been a shift between some system that has informed our political system of representation to something that I would call presentational. And the new technology has produced that. And that produces a weird instability of who and how we are constituted. And so I call it a representational media and cultural regime that has happened for about 2 centuries, that we're totally comfortable with, whether it's put on film, television, newsprint, and we become literal and literate within those dimensions over the last 2 centuries. It's produced a politics that has a dimension that we'll call sort of a version of democracy, but it doesn't necessarily have to be democracy. And I remember writing about this in about 2009, 2010. I said, we're probably going to move into a reactive political system. And then Trump came into existence. And it seemed to me that what happened with the emergence of Trump, and possibly, I don't know it well enough, but in Hungary as well, and in some other places as well, you have a different constitutive relationship between what represents and the performative presentational structure of humanity. And I think those are really interesting dimensions that I've looked at that are defining, yeah, how we have shifted in some ways right now. I brought up that foundation meeting. I think only Ross was there. Anyone else at the foundation meeting, or did you click on it in terms of online sort of thing? It was quite disruptive. We need to actually look at the transformation of ourselves via Zoom. It is an interesting sort of reconstruction of our work lives and our home lives and all sorts of other dimensions of it that we still don't have the research behind it. And it would, yes, have emotional dimensions that are different than if we were sitting together right now. But have we really explored it? No. Are we in a position to do it? Massively, especially university. And should we? Yes, we should do it collectively, and it should be a massive, massive book produced probably in about a week if we did it right. Anyway, so I'm sorry about all those dimensions, but I think representation, presentation, we've got some change in our cultural system that is quite large.
Interesting. Richard, you have your hand up.
Thanks, David. Just a really interesting presentation. I'm just was really impressed by the image when you showed about studying the kind of affect synchronization, millions of birds, they're acting at the same time, right? And is that in physics that's quite common because that objects like bridge, right? When people are walking on it, they automatically get into the same result like birds. But in this case, emotionally or in terms of their affect communication, but it's actually that we humans we share the similar collective affect synchronization with birds and with other primates. Do you see that can be magnified by the mass media, then the we media, then I media? Then I think next step will be the metaverse, where we move from Zoom, the two-dimensional Zoom meeting, into the multi-dimensional 3D model, where I can see you can limit through your living room or other places, right? Kind of vivid. Would you say that kind of like what sort of a threat or danger, because we are operating on our still very primitive evolutionary instincts or emotions, right? For example, this has kind of been articulated and actually crystallized in this pandemic response, where we see the government probably using kind of a PCA, principal components analysis to manipulate and control our reactions, and behind that now the big corporates like pharmaceutical companies, and other, So we think we are acting, individually, or we as a individual, but actually we're probably part of the scheme, right? So what do we build solution to that? Because we still haven't we're about completely that evolutionary affect loop, right? From the early days with primitive face to face, then we have language coming in as to offer that kind of a to refer to be able to express displaced emotions, affects. Then we into mass media and into media, So it's
we've just hit 1 o'clock, Richard.
Yeah,
so we better hand over to David for a quick response.
On that?
Yeah, I'll go quickly. That is a really conceptually good direction, and yeah, we have these changes of how we even use language, how we use screens, how we work our way through all those things that are changing, in a sense, yes, our emotional forms of communication. And I think, yeah, it needs work. We need to explore these things in a big way. And I would appreciate, what you've just said. I think it's actually really valuable to go forward with that as well. So if there's one goal of what having a research project is. I hope we can develop sort of collaborative ones to talk about these things further, because they will generate something for one or both of us or all of us, depending on who's involved. But I want to thank you for that. Actually, it was really interesting, but I have to think about it even more.
Yeah, top of your head.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we've just ticked past 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you particularly, David, for that really stimulating talk. Lots of connections with things other people are doing. So best of luck with that research. And I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking David for his presentation today.
All right, thank you.
So we'll be back
Thank you.
again soon with another SICS Research Seminar. So until then, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks, David.
bye-bye. Thanks.